For the last presentation, I want to introduce Marilyn Rotten, who is the coordinator of the regional coordinators and who will introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing our last speaker for the day, Barbara Benson, who is Director of Records Management Services for the University of Washington. And you may be thinking, records management, what does that have to do with all these studies we've been doing and study results? Well, most of you have been participating in studies and generating research records. Some of you have participated in several studies and generated a lot of research records, and whether they be consent forms or data collection forms. And Barbara is going to talk to us about some of our obligations as researchers, as precedent members, what your obligations are with regard to those records, and the obligations of the University of Washington. And I think she brings you good news. So, Barbara.
Thank you, Marilyn. I appreciate that. It's always nice to have the right answer to the question instead of an aggravating answer. So let me see how this thing works. No. There we go. So I have a very brief time, which is probably good, because most people find records retention and records management issues to be very boring, and I certainly don't blame you. It's very much a bit of baggage that comes after the very excellent work that you guys have been doing in the research projects you've been working in. And so to get through this rather quickly, what is records retention? These days, records retention is all about compliance. There are various state and federal regulations, rules, and statutes that govern the way we manage the information we create and receive. And in your case, because there is a sponsor, federal sponsors who have been funding these studies that you've been working in, there are a very specific set of requirements that you'll need to meet for that funding. And so let's talk a little bit about research compliance. What I've got on here is the basic University of Washington definition of a research grant, which you can see is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And the bottom line, when you cut to the chase, is any research that you're doing is considered to be a contract. And any contract that you have has a very strong legal component of it. Contracts are fulfilled in this case when they terminate, and termination is defined when the terms of the grant are completed. So let's take a quick look at the state and federal regulations that are involved here. You've got regulations regarding what type of records are being created. There's a list of records that have to be created to meet the contractual obligations that Northwest Precedent has entered into with their sponsors. An example of that, is a consent form. You're doing your research, but you're using what we would define as human subjects or people who are involved in the research, and as a result, you need their permission to enroll them not only in the study, but to accept what type of study and what type of actions you're going to be taking or have taken regarding them. A large part of regulations are how long the records are retained. Records are retained basically for a set amount of time, 1 year, 3 years, 6 years, but there's also a very important component in it that's called a cutoff, which is the catalyst that starts the countdown. In this case, the catalyst that starts the countdown is going to be the close of the study, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how your obligations relate to this particular date. And of course, the final regulation that we're going to consider is what happens to the data once the terms of the grant are completed. And since you are holding the data at this time, you have created the data and you're holding it, this is why we're speaking today, and this is the part that really concerns you. So what we're hoping is that everyone here and everyone who's not here able to be here today will choose to actively manage their issues or in their records. And the key part is know where your records are at all times. Regardless of paper or electronic format, you are responsible for them, and you need to be able to find them, open them, and read them for the full term of your obligation. We also need to know how long to keep those records, and I'll be going over that in a minute or two. And finally, I mentioned format very briefly before. You need to understand that there is no difference legally between formats. There is no difference between paper and electronic formats. You have the same responsibilities for both. And so, talking about those record-keeping responsibilities, everyone here was involved in one or more of these different studies that fell under the umbrella of Northwest Precedent. When we look at the studies, we look at the records that were created through them. And those records, and I do tend to categorize things as simply as possible. I like pigeonholes. They're very easy to work with. And so when you pigeonhole the records created through the different types of studies, we come up with 4 categories. You've got contracts and investigator agreements. These are the things that you signed with the Northwest Precedent, agreeing to the terms of this grant or contract. There are observational studies that were much less invasive with your study subjects than, say, randomized trials were. And there are also surveys, and I gather that you took some of the surveys yourself and your patients took some of the surveys. So let's look at each of these individually. This is the life cycle of the records management aspect of Northwest Precedent. It ends with the final data collection, which is something that we'll be talking about that will be happening shortly. Then once the data is collected, the data will be entered into a database. It will be reviewed by coordinators. Queries will be written and answered, and a sending log will be created. And then finally, the results will be published. And so we're in this home stretch right now, and we're looking at a countdown of an end date of April 1st, 2013. So even though, and this is an important point, even though some of you may have completed the studies that you were working on, the larger umbrella is what we're actually interested in. And the end date of responsibility in terms of record-keeping requirements for the larger umbrella of Northwest Precedent, we've decided or identified as April 1st, 2013. So the bottom line is between now, regardless of what status you're in with your own study, and April 1st, 2013, you bear the record-keeping responsibilities. At that point, at this date, those responsibilities will shift. And so let's look at what the responsibilities are and how they're going to shift. The easy one to look at, obviously, is the contracts and investigator agreements. The Northwest Precedent Data Coordinating Center is going to have the ultimate record-keeping responsibility for these type of records. Now, I know because you signed these things yourself, you all have copies of them. And I urge you very strongly to make sure that you have that copy until the April 1st, 2013 date, because that's when, as we define, the contract ends. At that point, any copies that you have in your own offices can be shredded if they're paper, or can be deleted if they're electronic. But before that date, I would strongly urge you to continue to maintain those records. And I have to say, I hope you have been maintaining them all along. And so the next one is observational studies. And I also put surveys on here because the retention requirements, how long to keep those records, is pretty much the same. Types of records include the consent forms and the study forms, which are those data entry forms you've been filling out the results of what you've observed. And the retentions will vary based on whether the study subject, your patient, was an adult or whether the patient was a minor. Study forms, regardless of age, must be retained for 6 years after the close of the study. And remember, we define the close of the study date as April 1st, 2013. The consent forms for adults are also 6-year records. However, minors are always, always much longer. The actual federal requirement for minors is 3 years after someone reaches age 18 or 10 years after last contact. Because you certainly have not been monitoring the age of your minor patients, it's much easier in this case to flatten it and use 10 years after last contact. And so for minors, the consent forms have that 10-year retention on them. And remember, we're also going to talk about who is going to bear the responsibility for maintaining these records for this full 6 or 10-year period. And I can start out by assuring you it's not going to be you. You just have that responsibility at least through April 1st, 2013. The last thing that we wanted, the last of those 4 categories we talked about a little bit earlier were the randomized trials. Everything has a consent form, and in this case, consent forms for minors and adult patients and the study forms on which you collected the data, which will be entered into the database, all have the same retention. And you'll note in this case that the retention period is actually quite long. The retention period for these records are 30 years. And that's because these records tend to be, for the randomized trials, because perhaps it was some kind of a drug that was administered or some kind of a specific procedure. We worry very much about the University of Washington. We take our ethical responsibilities very seriously. And we worry very much about an unforeseen adverse event in a second generation, especially when a drug is administered. And so as a result, the retention period that we have established that is aligned with the federal requirement and also in this case aligned with state requirements, because the university is a state agency and therefore we have to align with both, is 30 years. That was determined by a team that was set up at the university to alleviate any ethical concerns that we may end up facing in the future. But again, remember that you will not be required to keep the records yourself for 30 years. This is just to let you know the larger context of the situation. And so what is your own legal obligation? Your legal obligation is actually quite short. But you have the legal obligation now, and I need to stress that because we need you for any type of records you have created or received, and that also includes, unfortunately, any correspondence that may have taken place by email. You need to make sure that you are maintaining those records until our end date, which is April 1st, I say again, 2013. So right now, the legal obligation for all of these records belongs to each one of you. However, it will be transferred to Northwest PRECEDENT. What they need to do first to prepare to accept that responsibility is a data cleaning and analysis phase. And then at that point, when they know where they stand, which makes sense, a timeline will be established. And once that timeline is established, in other words, they can't accept all of your records at one time because it's just too much. And so they'll stagger and contact each of you, possibly by area, possibly by type of research that you were doing. And at that point, they'll start ingesting the records that you have in your offices right now, but they'll do it in different phases. And so you will be contacted once this data is scrubbed and once a timeline is established for it. And at that point, you'll be asked to send all of the records other than the signed contracts and the signed agreements to the Data Coordinating Center. At that point, when you are contacted, which will be on or about April 1st, 2013, at that point, you can shred or delete those records. And that is a very, very fast, because I know everyone wants to get to the social hour, and that is a very fast view of your record-keeping responsibilities. Does anyone have any questions or any comments or concerns?
The study I just described was a randomized controlled trial, but I hope there's no generational effect of the computer or pamphlet. Is it literally, because it's a randomized controlled trial, it needs to be kept for 30 years, even though there's not a drug or a medical intervention?
It's something that we'll definitely be looking into, but right now, we're taking a very conservative view of things. Okay. And until we actually see the research and have it in our hands and are better able to evaluate it, we're going to put that umbrella on it. But you're absolutely right. Under the circumstances, it may change in the future.
You said at some point we can get rid of we can shred our paper files, but I'm sure you know once you put it on a computer, you can never really get rid of it. It's in the hard drive no matter what you do. So how does that work?
It's not completely accurate. What happens, well, I have a couple of questions for you first, and they're very generic questions, so it depends on the circumstance. Do you back up your computers? Yes. Please say yes. Yes, I back up my computer. This is something that I would really like to hear, because if your computer crashes or something happens to the building, you know you're going to lose everything that's in there, including this data. And I should say as a caveat that if there is an event, as they call it, that takes place and your computer crashes, you are still responsible for the data that you lost. So it's very, very important to back up this data and anything else that you have. So I'm going to tack this in pieces. When you do your backups, which I hope you are doing, remember the backup is only for disaster recovery purposes. And so you should be using those tapes and rewriting those backups as you go or destroying them as you go. You do not want to keep your backup as long as you have the information on your computer. You're just capturing the latest information so that you can use it to replace if necessary. Now, when you have something on your computer, if you have something in email, email is very easy. You're receiving messages, you're sending messages in email. If you delete it, it doesn't go away. Absolutely correct. What happens is it goes into a deleted items folder or a trash can, depending on what email software, and they call it client, that you're using. And you have to go into that deleted items folder or go into the trash can and click on it again to empty the trash. So for email, you're deleting twice, and then you actually do get rid of it. If you don't delete that second time and empty the garbage, empty the trash or the folder, then you're still keeping it as another file. If you have something on your hard drive and you delete it, what you're doing is deleting the computer's roadmap to that particular document. And you're right, it's not going away, but the path that the computer uses to find the document is what's going away. And so at that point, if someone wanted to find that, they would have to have a lot of specialized computer knowledge, certainly more than I have on that. And that's why we tend to say that the standard that we tend to use at the university and pretty much in this state is that deleting is enough. In some types of data, we ask for it to be purged, which is much more difficult. But in this case, we don't think that the legal risk is high enough to do that. So you're right, the data is still on there, but the easy path that the computer uses to find it is gone. And for us, that's good enough.
One thing I'd like to clarify is the data they entered it electronically, but it was actually entered to a server at Axio Research. So
Excellent.
It's not on your computers.
Excellent.
Though you entered it electronically, you haven't retained any data. It's all being retained by Axio Research. So that will fall to the University of Washington Northwest Precedent and Records Management Services to manage that electronic data. The other thing that I did want to clarify is that because of a comment that was made, something about, so we are asking you We do not want you to shred anything right now. Right now, the whole point is that you're responsible for these records and you absolutely want to maintain them. As Barbara said, you need to know where they are. We may be contacting you to ask questions in terms of clarifying some of your data, so you'll want to have access to it. All the consents for all your patients, all your studies, and all the data collection forms. You want to maintain all of those. We will be contacting you over the course of this next year. Over the course of this next year, we will be contacting you and we will be sending you the materials you need to send us all your data. We don't want you to do it yet because, again, you may have to clarify some of the data that you've entered. So you may have to go back and look at the forms, and you may have to look at your patient's charts and make some changes or some corrections, answer some questions for us. But once we have the data cleaned for each individual study, we will be contacting you. We'll have our timeline. We'll contact you. We'll send you the materials, and then you will be sending everything to us so that you will not be shredding anything at all, okay? So Anne was asking about the x-ray that you took for the study 6 on the pulp capping study. And that was taken as a part of standard of care. So that is something that you will just maintain in your patient records. All we were asking you to do was read the x-ray and give us some information. And you filled that out in the data collection form. So you'll maintain the x-ray for that.
Were there any other questions or concerns or comments? Well, thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I should say, as always, if you have any questions, if anything comes up, please don't hesitate to contact Marilyn. And if she can't answer the question, I'll be happy to chime in. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Barbara.